From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Professor of English and American Culture Studies, and your host for Big Ideas. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. Joining us today is Putsata Reang, author of Ma and Me, a memoir that won the 2023 Pacific Northwest Book Award and was a finalist for the 2023 Lesbian Memoir/Biography Lambda Literary Award. She's an author, journalist, and is currently teaching memoir writing at the University of Washington School of Professional and Continuing Education. Also joining me today is Dr. Ellen McComas, Associate Professor of Speech Communication at BGSU Firelands and recipient of the 2019 Women of Distinction Award at BGSU. Thank you both for joining me today. Putsata, I'm going to start with you. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction to your career as a journalist and how you got started in your professional journey? When did you first know that journalism was something that you wanted to pursue?
Oh, well, thank you so much for that question, Jolie. And it's an easy answer for me. One of the things I'm so excited about being on your podcast is that in the past year and a half since my book came out, I think this might only be the second time that I'm being asked questions about my career as a journalist. And I actually see myself as a journalist first and an author second, because journalism is something that I feel like has just been in my blood. It started actually when I took my very first journalism class in high school. I grew up in a small town in Corvallis, Oregon, and there was this high school journalism class. I decided just to take it for fun because I'd always loved stories, and stories were sort of my way into the English language. I arrived in this country not speaking any English, and so it's a language I had to learn. I did come when I was a baby, so that helped me to pick up the language. But up until I entered kindergarten, I only spoke Khmer, which is the language of Cambodia, where I was born. And so what my mom would do is in the evenings, because she also didn't speak English, so though we had a TV, she couldn't understand it. So she would sit in her family room and she would just tell us stories. And I remember being so incredibly captivated by her stories. She would tell us about these village fools in Cambodia, always really funny stories, but stories that would have a lesson attached to them, either about working hard or working together or being smart, different things like that. And I understood very early on, I feel like that what happened in growing up with a mother who told stories orally was I became so enchanted and captivated. And immediately as a young kid, I understood the magic of storytelling. So that took me to my first journalism class in high school. I absolutely loved it. Just to be able to get access to other people's lives and try to figure out a way to put their stories on the page in a way that's compelling. Because, of course, as we know here with the communications department, that there are fantastic stories out there, but it's the way in which one tells them that has the ability to really captivate and inspire and compel readers or listeners. And so from there, I ended up majoring in journalism at the University of Oregon. I actually took a second major in English because for a time I thought I was going to be a teacher, not knowing that, in the future, that's what I would end up doing anyways. But I graduated with a journalism and English double major, immediately launched into a journalism career working for newspapers on the West Coast, up and down the West Coast. And again, just absolutely loved what I was doing. But when I turned 30, I ended up applying for a journalism fellowship. It's called the Alicia Patterson Journalism Fellowship. And this fellowship lets you go anywhere in the world. Now, even though I grew up in a family, my family, I really didn't know anything about the country from which we were from. So I applied to do some reporting about an issue that I kept seeing come up I was reading at the time an English language daily newspaper that was available online called the Cambodia Daily. This issue kept coming up about farmers being forcibly evicted from their lands, which is a topic that I'm very interested in, because at the time I was working in California at the San Jose Mercury News covering land issues and how tech companies were basically kind of cajoling and pressuring local jurisdictions to essentially, use policies as a way of getting lands from neighborhoods and homeowners to build their massive business parks. And so when I ended up going to Cambodia on this fellowship, I was 30 years old. Now, when I began to work on my memoir, and I set the timeline of major points in my life, I set it alongside major points in my mother's life when I narrowed down my memoir to my mom, and I realized, well, I was 30 years old when I crossed the Pacific Ocean to go back to Cambodia. She was 30 years old when she carried me out of our burning country when the war had started. And, I don't think that that's a mistake, or I don't think that that's I am somebody who believes in, the universe has greater gears at work sometimes, and I think that that's one of them. But I didn't, when I worked in Cambodia, apart from my 1 year on the fellowship, what I ended up doing was I ended up just staying. I fell in love with my own country, and I began working for an organization based in Washington, D.C. called Internews, where what we do is we travel to conflict to post-conflict nations to teach journalists in various countries international standards of journalism. And so age 30 kind of marked a shift away from me being a reporter to more me training reporters around the world. It's been an incredible journey, I have to say, an incredible ride.
Given that, I'm curious, what was the shift for you to then make the next turn, which was to actually turn to memoir writing? Was there kind of a moment or an experience that sort of made that next gear click into place for you?
There was, and it was unexpected. I suppose after all of the books that I read and stories that I read, that I shouldn't have been so expected, but it was personal, and it was that I met the woman who I would eventually marry. It was love. That was the big event that happened. I had actually been going along in my international career from age 30, for the next 10 years, bopping around different places, ended up in Afghanistan for a time, and then Thailand for another few years. I actually had thought I was never going to come back home to the U.S. I thought, no, I belong in the world. And I think by then I had also convinced my mom, who desperately wanted me back home in the U.S. I had convinced her. I said, one of the things I had learned as a journalist from journalism school is that you go where the story is. And I said, Mom, the stories that I'm so interested in are not here in the U.S., they're in the world. And so she had come, she'd warmed up to the idea that, her baby was going to be permanently moving around this world. I surprised myself and my family when I met my partner just on a very ordinary trip back to the States. I was visiting my two sisters in Seattle, and that's when I met my partner. I went back to, at the time I was living and working for Internews in Thailand, and at the time I had thought, well, this is impossible. I'm living half a world away. She's here in Seattle. I should just let it go. But I couldn't let it go, and I couldn't stop thinking about this gal who I'd met through a friend. And eventually we began to correspond over email, which became meeting over Skype in the different countries that I was traveling to at the time, whenever I could get a good, secure connection. And I came back to Seattle to visit with her one weekend when I was on holiday. And it kind of sealed the deal for me that this was not just feeling this was not just a temporary thing, I recognized very early on that this was the person I was going to spend my life with. And so I made the tough decision after spending about a decade abroad, working both as a reporter and then as a journalism trainer, to come back to the U.S. And I don't regret it, but I will say a part of me, my heart is kind of stuck out in the world. I'll be honest. I think that for us as journalists or as reporters, we're always wanting to. I mean, it's part of our profession, what we do. We're always wanting to go to the next place, wanting to get on to the next story. But that being said, the shift to eventually writing the book happened because when I moved to Seattle, I had to leave my career behind because my career was out in the world and it was not in Seattle, although Seattle is quite a big world. For me, coming from Corvallis, Oregon, I never intended to write this particular memoir. I just say that right up front. I wanted to write a book about my parents, and I wanted to examine this idea of survivor's guilt and how when my parents immigrated to America after we fled the war in 1975, my father was so beset by grief that 2 years later, in 1977, he had a nervous breakdown and was sent to a mental, or he was sent to the psychiatric ward of our local hospital in Corvallis. And it's something that had always fascinated me. I can't even remember when I first heard that my dad had a nervous breakdown. I think that it must have been over the course of me interviewing my parents about their lives. But I remember being very fascinated by this idea that, on the one hand, my relatives who had survived the genocide, that required both a physical survival as well as a mental survival. And then you have people like my family who escaped a war. And what you get is somebody like my father, and I'll put my mother in there as well. And there's a different kind of survival. It's surviving a new country and a new culture and a new language, but it's also an emotional survival of not knowing what had happened to your relatives back home. Later on in around 1980, when my parents began to discover who among their family members had died, and the toll was high for my family, it really sent my parents into a tailspin. The grief was so palpable. I was in kindergarten, first grade, right around there. And just witnessing my mother cry, not really understanding. I didn't understand a word. I didn't understand actually why we were here and why she was talking about people from another place called Cambodia that I didn't know about. All I knew was that something was making my mother cry and something was shutting my father off so that he had zero emotions. And so then as an adult, I wanted to write a book about that. But what had happened was when I made a decision to move to Seattle to be with my partner, my mother was not pleased. She had raised my sisters and I to marry men like she did and to become housewives like she did, to become mothers. And that's not what my life was going to look like if I chose to marry a woman. And so when I moved to relocated officially in 2015 to be with my partner, my mom and I ended up in this really just incredibly enormous fight and battle, essentially over my identity. And she questioned my she questioned my loyalty to my culture based on my decision to be with a woman as opposed to marry a man. And I questioned her openness and lovingness as a mother. And so we were kind of really just at odds with each other and really sparring about that. Now, my mom had known I was gay because actually I originally came out to her in my early 20s when I was a reporter in California at the San Jose Mercury News. But if I'm honest with myself in hindsight, it's pretty clear that either she didn't believe me or chose not to believe me or convinced herself that it was just a phase. And that eventually I would find a man to marry. And something that she had said to me when I was a kid growing up, and my sisters, was one day when you have a husband, you have to have a hot meal ready for him. And so I kind of took that that idea in the back of my head. And when I knew early on that I was gay, I tried to talk myself out of being gay by saying, but Mom said I'm going to one day have a husband. She didn't say wife, she said husband. And I kept telling myself, I will find one of these things eventually. And when I realized, no, that's not in the cards for me. That's not who I am. It was a tough reckoning. It was tough reckoning. I went through some depression, for sure, at the time. I think that it wasn't until meeting my partner, who I eventually married, that I was through most of that reckoning, and I was feeling very calm about the idea of marrying a woman as opposed to a man. And what had happened was all of this conflict was happening while I was thinking about writing this book about my parents. And being a journalist and being a creative storyteller are very different crafts and skills. And so I had to switch gears and instead of being all facts and data and information and research and whatnot, I really had to switch gears in terms of writing itself. And so I decided to take a class here in Seattle at a writing studio called Hugo House, because I thought if I'm going to write a book, I want to write it. I didn't want to write a journalistic book, an account of my parents. I wanted it to be creative writing. And I took this class, and it was something, the title was something called like personal essays, writing your personal essay, something like that. And I thought, sure, why not? Well, that single class basically changed the entire course of the book project, because when I went in, I thought I was writing one book. When I left, I was writing a completely different book. And that had to do with the single question that the teacher, Nicole Hardy, herself a memoirist, or an assignment that she gave us. And she said, we'll be writing a few short personal essays, but then your big assignment, you have to write a 3,000-word personal essay. And I raised my hand and I said, well, what's the topic? To which Nicole replied, I don't know, write about a conflict. And so I go home to my partner and I tell her, can you believe the gall of this teacher? All she said was write about a conflict. To which my partner looks at me. And I said, no. I'm not writing about that. I'm not writing about my mom and I. My mother will kill me if I write about it. And my partner, April, said, well, maybe if you write about it, that'll help you kind of understand it and maybe understand your mom better. She said a lot of really good things, actually. And I was so resistant to the idea. But sure enough, when I sat down to do the assignment, I tried to write just about everything except that conflict, because it was so real and so raw in the moment and so painful for me. I couldn't run away from the emotions at hand. One of my friends who is a novelist once told me to write hot and edit cool. Well, the thing that was hot at the moment was this conflict, of course. And I might as well just try. So I did, and I submitted the story, workshopped it. When April came to pick me up after class, the day that I workshopped mine, she said, well, how did it go? I said, oh, everybody cried. And I just loved it. And she said, you love making people cry, don't you? I said, no, it's not so much that I love making people cry. It's that if you manage to write something that generates an emotion, you've done your job well. And so she said, well, are you going to share it with me? And so I did. And she read it and she cried. And my sister, I've got 3 sisters, and one of whom here in Seattle, she was also an English major at the University of Oregon. We sat in the same Shakespeare classes together. And so she comes from the same storytelling instinct and impulse that I have. And so I would often send her my newspaper stories. And I decided to send her this essay that I wrote about my mom and I fighting over me being gay. And my sister read it and she emailed me back right away and she said, your story made me cry. My sister, I feel like she's got a heart of stone. Like she doesn't ever cry or show emotions. And wow, if it is making my sister cry, then there's something. And then she said something that changed my life. And she said, are you going to send it out to be published? I said, oh, no. Mom is going to kill me if this gets out there. she's going to absolutely kill me. I said, this was just for class and, forget about it. But she continued to push and she said, maybe there are other people out there who are in your shoes and would benefit from hearing your story. My partner said the same thing. I had two women nagging at me and I thought, okay, this is impossible. So I sent it to the place that I knew would reject it. I sent it to the New York Times and forgot about it. And 4 months later, on the day that my wife and I closed on our house, we were looking to buy a house at the time. I get a call look at my phone and it says New York Times. And I answered and I said, oh, we already subscribe. I've been a lifelong subscriber to the New York Times. I've always, and then whatever city that I lived in, I take the local paper, but I always take the New York Times all my life since college. And the guy said, no, wait. I'm not calling about your subscription. I'm Daniel Jones. I'm the editor of the Modern Loves column for the New York Times. We're calling about the story you submitted and we want to publish it. And I just about collapsed because I thought, how incredible to have that opportunity, but also my mom is going to kill me. You don't say no when the New York Times calls. And so, of course, I let them publish it. And that just started this whole snowball effect of agents calling and all sorts of interest in the story of my mom and I being in conflict over me being gay. And so that's where the story came out. I will say that I went into the process very unwillingly. My editor essentially had to drag me through this whole memoir writing process because I kept resisting it because I thought, I'm feeling the pain right now. And what I understood about memoir and what I understood about writing about one's life was that we're meant to look backwards. And I thought, how on earth am I going to be able to look at my life in an objective way? See, that was the journalist in me, again, always with that mindset of trying to have an objective story. But how could I look at my life and look at this conflict in an objective way if I'm currently in the middle of it? But what I discovered was that actually sometimes that's the best place to write from. I talk about this idea in my memoir writing classes about the existential wound, which comes from U.S. poet Natasha Trethewey's book Memorial Drive. Her memoir is one of those, I call them book Bibles. I have about 5 or 6 memoirs that travel with me wherever I travel. I've traveled a lot the past year and a half. And she talks about this idea of the existential wound, which is a wound that we all carry that doesn't ever heal. And it was with that idea that I proceeded to write my memoir, recognizing that for me, my existential wound was that I had always felt that I owed my mother this debt. I knew I owed her, and that debt was actually two-pronged. The debt was culturally because when you are born female in Cambodia, immediately you come into debt to your parents for bringing you into this world and raising you. And then when you are married and to your husband's family, that debt gets transferred to your husband. And so you as the daughter no longer carry the debt, your husband carries it for you. And, but there was a second thing, and there was a second reason why I felt this incredible debt, which is that when I was a baby, not quite a year old, that was when my family escaped the war in Cambodia. My family, because of my father, his job was working as an accountant in the Cambodian Navy, which meant that on April 17th, 1975, when the communists in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, captured my country, my father and my family was allowed one of the very coveted spots on board a Navy vessel that was evacuating. Now, there was not a destination, and the point was just to leave Cambodia and leave our burning country. And I was a baby at the time. And the way that my mom had always told me the story was that there was not much food and water on the ship. And about 10 days into that journey, still the captain not knowing where the ship was going to go, my mother tells me that I'd stopped crying, I'd stopped eating, I'd stopped moving. My eyes had, she describes how my eyeballs had moved to the back of my head, and she worried that I had either died or was in the process of dying. And when the captain of the ship came by around day 10 to evaluate his passengers, he bent down to my mom and he told her, "Your baby is dead. You have to throw this baby in the water." But my mother, being the stubborn person she is, refused. And when I asked her later about that moment, she said to me, I asked her point blank, I said, "Ma, did you think I was dead?" And she said, "Well, I had a little hope left that you were still alive." And another 2 weeks later, that ship eventually reached the Philippines to an American naval base. Doctors there discovered that I was still alive, barely, but nevertheless, I was still alive. And so suddenly now, I'm a kid growing up in America, and I'm hearing this story, my own origin story. And that becomes a second debt for me. And the question arises, what do you owe the woman who gave you life? And in my case, what do you owe the woman who gave you life and saved your life? And because of those twin debts, I felt like I couldn't betray my mother by marrying a woman and by being who I was. And so I really tucked that part of me so deep down inside, but I was so unhappy, going through so much depression, because I know I was gay, but then I had this other, this debt to contend with. And so that became that existential wound, what Natasha Trethewey talks about in her memoir. That was that wound for me. It was the wound that just would not heal. I couldn't escape it. There was a particular pain there. I mean, on the one hand, I think that us being in the communications department and being storytellers, stories so often, it's a matter of perspective. It's where we begin our stories and where we end our stories that have so much bearing on kind of our psychological being and our well-being and whatnot. And for a long time, I thought that my story ended there, on that boat, when my mother refused to throw me overboard. And I kind of got trapped into this single narrative that I was the kid of all of her children, the runt in the family, the weak one who always got ill and who always needed caretaking. That was the single story that I had told myself because of the story my mom told me about us escaping the war and me almost dying on the boat. And so in my mind, I'd always ended my story there, not realizing that actually that baby would one day grow up and become her own person and make her own decisions. And part of growing up and making my own decision was also who I was going to marry and who I wanted to spend my life with. I eventually got there and I felt okay with the idea and with the decision of honoring myself and claiming my own selfhood and being true to who I was at the expense of my relationship with my mother. Because once I made that decision, she stopped talking to me completely, which was really hard because my mom and I have always been close. But that being said, I just think that, one of the things I think so often about is that, for those of us who are storytellers, I think that there's this responsibility we have to tell the stories that are true and resonant, even if, like in my case, you're resisting it. Because one of the things that's been so surprising the past year and a half when my memoir came out is just the depth and the breadth of connection that readers have to it. I've been surprised. I assumed that most of the people who would find my book resonating with them are other Asian American queers, people like me. And it turns out, actually, most of the people that I've been hearing from in letters and when I've been speaking around the country are straight women, in fact, and straight women who end up coming to the different talks that I do. And what that says to me is that it gets to me what the beating heart of storytelling is, which is this idea that all of us as humans is seemingly conditioned to experience universal things and emotions. These are the 5 core emotions of is it happiness, joy, disgust, anger, fear, I think, but also the experiences of love and loss. Those are all universal as well. But then, of course, what makes stories so compelling is our personal take on those universal experiences. And so a lot of feedback that I've been given from audiences around the country and from letters, fan letters, is that people really resonate with the mother-daughter conflict. You know, she got the piece of, me being gay, and that's what people have been honing in on. And I think that this is also part of the human condition, is that eventually we're bound to have conflict with those who we love. It's unavoidable. To me, anyways, I think that's part of it's part of the agreement that we enter when we choose to love. That it's not always going to be peaceful. It's not always going to be happy. There's going to be conflict along the way. And to date, I have yet to meet somebody who's not ever had a conflict with their mother. And so I think that was a pretty universal theme to explore in my memoir.
Absolutely. Sue Ellen, tell us a little bit about your own career and journey into academia, but also how you got into communication as a discipline and as, your own interest in stories and storytelling.
Well, what's interesting is that I was born to a family of storytellers, having been born in the South. And when my father would tell me stories, very much the same, they were stories that were vivid. They were stories that explained what it was like to be in a small space in a coal mine. And he would have me get under the dining room table and say, now try to do this. And I couldn't do it. And he said, well, that's what it was like, right? So I entered academia very unconventionally. Mine is not the typical story. I do things backwards a bit. So it's been a real roller coaster. And it's not conventional. I entered academe not right after high school. I was not ready. I wasn't emotionally mature enough. I just wasn't ready. So I took some time and I traveled around and I saw some friends, and I moved to Columbus, Ohio, into German Village, and carved candles for a living to barter for a haircut and those kinds of things. And I just really had always enjoyed the community there, which is mostly LGBTQIA. And that was in 1973. And I've just always kept friends and went through that era of AIDS and seeing some of my friends pass away with no family because their family rejected them. And oftentimes it was just too late by the time their families did come around. And that was devastating to me, that could happen. I'm cisgender. They accepted me for who I was, and we had wonderful relationships. After that, I was a poor artist, still carving those candles, and I decided that it was time to make some money, and I came back to Sandusky, and I got a job in the factory, GM factory, where my mother and my father worked. Now, as a Southern tradition, you are told, just like Putsata's family, different bit, but similar. Just, you're going to come to the factory, you're going to find a good man who will take care of you. Well, that was not my plan. My plan was to get in there, get some quick money, and get the heck out of there. So I ended up meeting someone and filling my parents' expectations. So one thing after another. I would take classes occasionally, but there I was, married in the country with 2 children and living what I was supposed to be, the good quintessential wife who took her kids to church on Sundays. Because that was the other thing. Living in a family that was steeped in fundamental religion was part of what we did. I still have memories of my grandmother braiding my hair while I recited verses. And that's something that has shifted very much, right? So after going through so many different shifts and so many different things with raising children, I found myself a single mom. And at that point in time, my kids, they were a little older, they were in high school. And so I thought, this is my time. I'm going back to take some classes. Well, the first class I took was a math class because I figured if I could do that, I could do anything in life. Because math is not my forte at all. And so I'm the type of person that says those letters and numbers don't need to be in the same line. That doesn't work. So after that, I went and started taking theater classes and art classes. And, let me back up. I have to back up a little bit because when I first came back and was working in the factory is when I started taking the theater and the art classes. Then I met the man that I married, filled the expectations, and then ran away from that. And that's when I went back to school full time and started taking communication classes, got back into theater, and had a very good experience while I'm reading these communication books going, this is my life. This applies to everything I do. So I was drawn because of the stories and the idea that communication studies, I have one set methodology. I like to do interview and qualitative, tell stories, narratives, but my topics change. And I'm not afraid to enter some pretty raw topics. I don't know if it's age or what, but I feel as though I have earned the right to talk about what I want to talk about. And so I went back and had an affinity for communication and just kept going and kept going and kept going. One thing was I didn't know what I wanted to do. Here I was, I'd raised 2 children. I was in my late 40s, and I ended up at 55 finishing my PhD. So that led to my job now, and I absolutely love it. I teach also women's studies, which is a great course for me because it lets me use examples from my own lived experiences. I realized also that how dysfunctional my family communication was, not only when I was a child, but as an adult, and I had some work to do. So all these things started coming to the forefront. And it was cathartic because I was working through a divorce, and I was working through trying to do all of these things and finish school through menopause. I don't know if you want to cut that or not. But the idea, I would not advise it, all right? Let me just say that. I would not advise it. But it was a challenge, right? And I was learning so much, and I had such a quest for learning because in my family, there wasn't advanced education. My parents didn't really stress it, and we were very working class. So I was able to apply what I was learning to self-improvement and follow what I really wanted to do, which was teach people about so many different topics and add experience to it and stories. And that's where I had a love for storytelling to begin with, but that gave me an opportunity to look at styles of writing like autoethnography, where I could have that shift between what's happening in society and how did that happen in my life. And so there was a bit of me in there. There's a bit of theory and the academic requirements. So that was pretty much, my way, my path, my journey into academia. And I wouldn't change it, except menopause part.
Can I jump in and say one thing?
Sure.
So Ellen, I'm so incredibly inspired by you and your story. What an incredible arc. And I couldn't help but thinking of this idea, and I don't know if you or other professors in the communications department teach this idea something that I learned early on as a journalism student, which was write what you know. And I think that the beauty of your story is that what I kept thinking of listening to you was, that makes such perfect sense. Not only write what you know, which is what I've been told, and then what I ended up practicing as a journalist. But here's Sue Ellen, because I'm, a storyteller, I like to swap out words, and I want to say, teach what you know. And how incredible for your students to be able to learn from you and from your experience and get the real life lessons that you had within an academic setting and tied to the pedagogy of what you're trying to get across. To me, it sends chills down my spine for how inspiring you must be as a teacher.
Well, thank you. I did have a student take my class once, and she said she went on professor, rate your professor, whatever those are. I don't go to those. But she said that most of the reviews were either they loved me or they hated me, so she figured I might be okay.
Yeah. That's great.
Well, I have a question sort of about kind of your role as teachers, right? You're both writers and teachers. And I think in different ways, but both of you are also teaching a lot of non-traditional students, right? And students who have a lot more different kinds of life experience than maybe we think of as the kind of typical 18-year-old college student. You may be working with students who are working full-time, supporting families, later on in life, coming back to kind of learn a new set of skills. So sort of two questions related to that. How do you think your own life experiences inform your work as both a writer and a teacher? I guess that's one part. And the other is there anything you would like our listeners to understand about the life experiences of the non-traditional student?
I love working with my non-traditional students because I was there. I was always the oldest one in the room. My professors were, some of them could have been my children. And so I was always the one that felt like, do I belong here? Do I belong here? It gets back to that belonging. Do I fit in here? And what I found was that I could add things and learn things from the students, but mostly what I've discovered now on the other side of it is that I love it. The students bring in such rich stories, and the way I teach and ask them to delve into those things, it just brings a dimension of richness, because some of these people, some of these women in particular, have gone through things that these kids are only reading about in the books. They were around. I was around with Roe versus Wade. We've seen all of that come to, to where it is now. So we discuss these things, and they add so much that I am always thrilled, because they end up being kind of like co-teachers with me, right? Because I'll say to my students, if I'm not explaining this in a way that you understand, if you think you have an idea, or go for it. It's a very student-centered type of atmosphere. And of course, I'm facilitating, but that's what I tell the students. I'm a facilitator. I'm not here to just throw ideas down at you and for you to be this empty vessel who's, pulling them on and believing everything. Don't believe everything I say. Go look for things, look things up. And so it is very, to me, so much more real, because we have more generations in the same spot that are sharing their stories. And the young women always gravitate to the older women in the class. They'll start out not sitting next to each other, and before I know it, they're going out for coffee. They're probably going out for drinks. I mean, it builds community, and that's my goal in the classes is to build that community so we understand each other better. So,
yeah, I absolutely agree with what Sue Ellen just articulated here, and also just want to add that it's that moment when classrooms become collaborative that it's so exciting for me as a teacher, and that has really only happened in my experience because I also teach middle school and high school age students. That has only happened with non-traditional students, and in my classes, I also should put an aside. I've taken time away from teaching this year, so I'm no longer currently teaching at University of Washington. And I had to make the tough decision to, just because my travel schedule was so was so hectic, to step away from that. I will begin teaching my middle school and high school students again this coming winter. But it's this idea that when classrooms become collaborative, which in my experience, teaching memoir has only happened with non-traditional students. And I see the students really helping each other understand concepts that I'm trying to get across. And more than that, that they're trusting each other, and they're trusting each other's feedback. They're trusting each other to talk about these writing prompts that I give that are not easy, and that really go straight to the heart. A couple of the writing prompts that I give have actually led some students to write essays that they've gone on to get published. And one of them is very simple, which is, where does it hurt? And I leave it there, and I let the students take that wherever they want to take it. But then the other one comes from one of my favorite memoirists and writers, Kaisi Limon, who wrote this essay, and he had a prompt for his students: how do you want to be loved? And it's been incredible to see the responses of my non-traditional students, and those because they have the life experience to back up whatever they're going to write about. Almost all of my students in my University of Washington memoir class, when I was teaching it, were either currently working or retired. And what was really fantastic about that mix was that, as Sue Ellen talked about, you get the different generations, and therefore you get the different perspectives. And of course, what that engenders is absolutely incredible discussion that happens. But one of the things I learned in terms of teaching memoir that I picked up from one of my most beloved teachers, my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Hedges, is that what Mrs. Hedges did when I arrived in her kindergarten class, not speaking a word of English, was that she managed to somehow create a safe space for me to be there. It goes back to the topic of belonging that Sue Ellen so well articulated. When we enter a classroom, we want to know that we belong. And as the one brown kid in the class who didn't speak English, I knew I didn't belong. But it was Mrs. Hedges who created somehow the space that made me feel like I did belong there. She was very patient with me to teach me the alphabet. I didn't know the alphabets when I entered kindergarten. She was very patient with me to teach me that, and to teach me one-syllable words here and there. And I've taken the spirit of Mrs. Hedges. Mrs. Hedges is still alive, by the way. She organized a book event for me in our hometown, Corvallis, which was just amazing. And she was reunited with my mother because my mother remembers her so fondly and whatnot. And but it's the spirit of what Mrs. Hedges did, creating that safety for everybody in class, that I really take into my classes, and I was so inspired by, particularly when it comes to memoir writing. We're writing stories that have been buried in many cases so deep down inside. I will say that probably every quarter, not every class, but every quarter, students have ended up in tears because it's difficult, right? To kind of go backwards and reckon with the past. And so one of the things that I like to do is, immediately, as I was teaching class virtually, and I would have done this had it not been for the pandemic, and we would have been meeting in person. But is to make be intentional about breaking the students up into groups of 2 or 3, just so that they have an opportunity to talk to each other and get to know each other. Because I think that is the kind of thing that, engenders the trust that we all needed in that class to dive deep into our stories. But I do give Mrs. Hedges, I think this interesting is that I think, it's well, and I don't know, maybe you can add on to this or to say your thoughts about this too. But I just get the sense that we all have that one teacher who kind of, really just made such an impact and changed our lives. And it feels odd to say that a kindergarten teacher at the very beginning of my academic career and as my life as a person would have such an impact. But I think it demonstrates the power of great teachers out in the world. We never forget them.
So it's funny because I wasn't a good student, for one thing. I had ADHD, and at that time, all you did was get sent to the principal's office for not paying attention. So, I found out later on, diagnosed, cool, it's great. But you have this one teacher, like you said, who is so instrumental in your path. And for me, that was the first person who ever got me up to speak, because I was a stammerer as a child. And that was my theater teacher. Also, communication teacher. So I had her early when I first started taking theater classes at the college in, what was that, 1976 or so, or 70, around 76. And then again when I went back in like 99 or 2000 or something like that. So she was still there. She's still vivacious. She still lives, and she's just amazing. And I had dropped out of college twice because I didn't have the nerve to go up and speak in a college class. That I owe to Dr. Jan. Yeah, that I owe to Dr. Jan. She was very patient with me, and the only reason I got there was because she introduced me to theater first. That came first. I could do all kinds of things if I wasn't who I was, right? That's the actor who made that mistake. It's not me. I didn't do that. So I could handle that. But getting up and talking to people about who I am or what my topic is was just devastating. So I would imagine that many of my high school teachers would probably be rolling over in their graves right now if they knew what I was doing. They sure would be. Because I was terrible at speech class. I hated it. So I keep that in mind, because I know I've had students who, just before a speech, they're getting sick or they're crying, or it can be difficult, very difficult. So I really try to keep that in mind, and I let them know that I'm specifically there to help them through their goal, because I don't want them to be like me and put things off because you were afraid. You didn't have the self-confidence. I want them to know that I've been there. So,
what's so beautiful about that?
Yeah, it was Dr. Jan.
Dr. Jan?
Yeah.
Is that it, Sue Ellen?
Yeah, Dr. Jan Gland. She was she was the theater department for a long time.
What's so beautiful about that anecdote is that it's clear that Dr. Jan helped you find your voice. And just knowing the little bit about your background and how being raised in a, in fundamental religion, oftentimes in those circumstances, as in a very conservative culture, Cambodian culture, we don't have agency. We don't have a voice. There has to be somebody along the way who helps us find that voice, and that's pretty incredible.
Thank you. She is amazing. She's an amazing woman. But yes, you're right. And that was when I was reading your book, Putsata. I have so many notes in there that I am relating to your book. I'm relating to your experiences of the mother-daughter relationship, the expectations, the liminality that we find ourselves in when things are shifting and you don't quite know which way to go. So one of my favorite sayings is there is no solo performance. I didn't get here by myself. I have many, many co-authors in my life. And I hope that I've been able to look at those and evaluate them and see how they've changed me, how they brought things to the forefront that I would not have otherwise known.
Can you do a TED Talk next? I love that so much. We're not a solo performance. Is that what you said?
Yes, we are. There are no solo performances.
I'm writing that down.
There are none. Yeah,
So beautiful.
There are none. Everything adds to our story.
We're going to take a quick break. Thanks for listening to the Big Ideas podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Welcome back to the Big Ideas podcast. Today I'm speaking with Putsata Reang, author of the memoir Ma and Me, and Dr. Sue Ellen McComas, Associate Professor of Speech Communications at BGSU Firelands. Putsata, we've been talking about teaching, about being writers. Back to your book. For listeners who haven't yet read your memoir, but we hope will go out and purchase it immediately, what would you like them to know about you and your work?
Oh, I have not been asked that question. I've been asked a lot of questions in the past year and a half. Amazing. I love that question. That ultimately, I'm somebody who was able to find the courage to claim my own selfhood. I think that it's something that that's hard for us to do. To not only reckon with who we are as individuals and our identities, and it goes back to what I'm sure the quote that both of you know well, Walt Whitman's poem where he says, we contain multitudes. And I certainly discovered that in my own life, because it's not enough that I'm a queer Cambodian refugee, but I'm also a queer Cambodian refugee who loves country western music, car shows, and football. And, a couple of those things don't jive with my family. The football does, because I come from a family that absolutely loves sports and football. But the country western and the car shows, my sisters especially, just kind of scratch their heads. Like, what? We all grew up together. How did you develop an interest in car shows and country western? Like, you definitely need to be back in Corvallis. But there comes this question of authenticity. What parts of ourselves are we willing to give expression to and allow ourselves to be, and what parts do we keep hidden for fear of shame or for fear of embarrassment, and what have you? And so I hope that readers would know me as that person and maybe be inspired in some way to do the hard work of reckoning with yourself and then claiming your own space and claiming your own truth and being able to speak it and use your own voice. I think it's that. And also there's another piece here, which is something that I learned in the process of writing my memoir, which is to always extend grace. I had a lot of anger towards my mom while I was writing my memoir that I had to work through, because I decided that I couldn't write that anger onto the page. It wouldn't have been fair to her, and it wouldn't have been fair to the story. I don't think any reader. I think any reader will pick up on the fact that you haven't really processed and worked through your complex emotions in a situation like that. But I eventually got to a place of grace with my mother when I understood, the more I thought about it as I was writing it, and that's, I think, to me, where writing becomes cathartic. The more I thought about our situation, the more I realized, well, my expectation was that my mother would love me regardless. She's in America, and that's kind of an American sentiment that our parents and our families accept us for who we are. It's not particularly a Khmer sentiment, but we were not in Cambodia, we were in America. And I eventually got to a place where I understood that I could not expect my mother to check in her culture at the border when we came to America. It's in her already. And at the same time, here she was raising her daughters in an American culture that she could not expect us to be fully Khmer, that there had to be room for us to be Americans also. And so in that way, I think that if we as humans are able to extend grace to each other, I just think that there maybe would be a lot less conflict. And I go back to this thing that why am I forgetting the word when it's like a quote at the beginning of a book or chapter? What's that word? Epigraph. That's right.
Epigraph?
Thank you, Jolie. I think often of this epigraph at the beginning of my book, and it's a quote from the novelist Putsata Reang, who himself actually has just come out with a memoir recently. And he says, there will be no end to war unless each of us calms the conflicts inside of us. And I think that is so important, not only in this current moment in time, but also just in general. Outside of this current moment when there are wars happening in so many places, we forget to look at the wars that are going on inside of ourselves. And, ultimately, I think that if there could be one takeaway from my book, it's that have the courage to look inside, have the courage to deal with some of those warring parts of who you are. Try to find some calm within that, because it's going to change fundamentally how you look at the world and how you look at yourself and your place in it.
Right. That's beautiful. And grace is so important teaching at this time. This is a difficult time to be teaching so many topics, especially if you're in women's studies or where that entire list is on of disparaging words, I guess. So they say the list is on every PowerPoint I have. So I don't know. It's difficult, I think, for students to give grace sometimes because they're set in their ways and they feel as though you're trying to change them when actually you're trying to help them open. And that grace is so important. I just love the concept of grace. I think it's human. Even though we don't do it like very much, it is very. I just lost my dog, so I feel as though sometimes my dog was more humane than many people, and dogs can be. So that idea of grace between human beings is so needed. So thank you for bringing that up. That is so powerful and important.
Yeah, we forget to extend grace to each other so often.
Yes.
And I think that we, as humans, we could use a little bit more reminding on that.
Yeah, and grace to ourselves. Grace to ourselves as well, so that we can show that to others. Yes, I agree.
Sue Ellen, thinking about Putsata's upcoming visit and, the students you teach, what do you want students to know? What do you want them to know in order to read the book or to entice them to come to this event and to expand their own knowledge and experiences through reading about other people's lives?
Well, in my courses, I do a lot of disclosure, and sometimes I have to be very careful because there's a difference between disclosure and vulnerability, right? If you get too far, you've gone over the edge and talk about things like menopause. So the idea of teaching Putsata's book is not going to be difficult. I found it absolutely. I mean, I've got so many things in here. Negotiating identities between two cultures, to and fro, identities, Martin, Kentucky, where I was born, family dysfunction, my mom and my sister and me. So these notes go so far into this book, and I could teach everything from the very beginning, talking about displacement, because that has really come to the forefront right now. I think I was ignorant to how many people are displaced at this moment on our globe. And it's heart-wrenching, but so many people don't know, and especially kids who don't watch any news, they don't know. They're going about their own lives like we did when we were kids, right? But all of the story, from the war, the reason of leaving, the different various reasons for leaving. I'm planning on using this in intercultural communication, because what I'd love to do is set up a study abroad where students have an opportunity to learn more about this topic in a more personal way, right? To hear from all sides. to hear from lawyers, from NGOs, from the people who have experienced it, the people who have become successful in this country after coming over, just all aspects and all perspectives, because there are so many. And that way, too, I'm not telling them this is right or wrong. This is just what's happening. This is what's going on. And so you can take it from there and then go into the issues. If I were teaching interpersonal or relationships, right? Interpersonal communication goes all the way through families. So you could talk about families in there. I mean, I see this in every class I teach.
It's amazing.
So thank you, Putsata. Thank you, Putsata. I'm coming to visit you.
Excellent.
Okay?
You know, when you do, you can plan on having a home cooked Cambodian meal. Word got out that I'm pretty good.
Please.
You know, I just realized also listening to you. So can I say one thing? Add a brief thing to what you're saying. You know, earlier, Jolie, when you asked about some of the takeaways or what you would like people to know, what I think, and I think that this is also important for college students, whether traditional or non-traditional in a higher education setting, is that very often we arrive to these classrooms with sometimes burdened or sometimes weighted with the expectation of family. And I think that's the beauty of Sue Ellen's story paired with mine, is that both of us experienced that when we were growing up, who we were supposed to become, and not only who we were supposed to become, but what was expected of us, specifically as women. And one of the things that I think a lot about is really the cover of my book, which is there's a crocodile and a tiger, which goes back to a saying that my mom has, "Jotak bo lang lo kla," go in the water, there's the crocodile, come up on land, there's the water. And so often, particularly at this moment in time, specifically with non-traditional students, is that they've reached this juncture in their lives where they've got to make a choice. If I could say anything, it's to make a choice that feels most true to you, despite the consequences and despite what you could be facing on the other side of not making another choice. Because if I learned anything along the way, and Sue Ellen, you probably can relate to this, you know, is that we only have one shot at this life. And if we're busy living it for others, by the time we get around to living it for ourselves, it's going to be too late, you know, or it could be too late. And so why not just make those decisions now?
Yes. And it is a choice. It's always a choice that you make, but while you're making that choice, while you're in that liminal space of betwixt and between, it's like an irritant. It's also like a blossoming flower, because you have such opportunity, and being true to yourself is so important, and something that I didn't learn for so very long. And then one of the hardest things I ever did was saying, you know, I'm not going to be married anymore. This is, you know, I'm sorry, I'm breaking up a family, I guess. And that was taught to me that was the worst. You just never. And plus I was kind of rejecting my mother's and my sister's marriages that were somewhat similar to mine. And that became a whole issue of not belonging now, and then going to college at a very late age. Oh, we won't even be able to talk to you now. So the feeling of being aside from them, but yet still connected to them, and how much I could allow their influence, and how much I had to, for my own health and my own identity, to be who I was, walk away when I needed to walk away. And that those are tough decisions for everyone in life. And I think everyone goes through those, right? No. I really like your book.
Oh, thank you so much. It's amazing. I haven't.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. Any last advice or things that we haven't touched on that either of you want to make sure to say before we close?
I think I might add one thing, which is that the non-traditional students who I've had the honor to work with, and the privilege to work with, so often they've never taken a writing class before. They've come from careers in tech or in the medical field, or, they're currently in fields like teaching or any number. There are so many different professions represented among the non-traditional students I've taught. And one of the things that I would say that is so important, and this is for non-traditional students, whether you are a memoirist and a creative writing major and writer or not, whether you are a math major or a tech major or any other field of study that interests you, is that don't worry about getting your story right, but try your best to just write it. And I would say this, to my memoir students, but to any student, is to try to get your own story down. And you can worry about the grammar, you can worry about things later, but it's so important that we make a record of our lives and make a record of who we are, to say that we were here, we existed. I think a lot about the hieroglyphs and caves of the cavemen who wanted to make a record of their lives, with the, spears chasing the buffalo and whatnot. We wouldn't have had that if somebody didn't have the thought, and the cavemen and cavewomen did, to record their stories on the walls of those caves. We all have stories to tell. And I think that if we can be vulnerable enough and find the courage to tell those stories, it's just going to make our world better, to be able to share and connect in that deep way with each other.
Absolutely. The one thing I would leave with is that stories matter because people matter. We live by stories. We are our stories. And what we tell ourselves and what we tell each other is important because we're important.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Putsata and Suella. This was wonderful. Listeners, Putsata will be visiting BGSU Firelands to talk about her memoir on Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024 at 6:30 p.m. in the Cedar Point Center Auditorium in Huron, Ohio. That event is open to the public and will also be available via live stream. After the presentation, Putsata will participate in a brief Q&A and book signing. No tickets are required. For more information about this event, visit the BGSU campus calendar. Listeners can keep up with ICS happenings by following us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. You can listen to Big Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. This script was researched by Autumn Dunaway, Delana Harris, and Allison Sporing, and written by Delana Harris and Allison Sporing. Sound engineering was provided by Brendan Akadora, Phil Beskid, and Marco Mendoza.